All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. We're excited to talk about the next panel group. Is we have three really great speakers from around the country, and we're going to talk about resiliency. This was about a year ago that Sandy came, and a lot has happened with resiliency over the past year, and debatably not enough. And I think some of the perspectives you'll hear today from the different speakers are really suggestive of how resiliency is a new way of thinking about planning and about how we provide electric service to the end user, and that a resilient electric grid, in my view, is oxymoronic, right? What resiliency is fight through. It's survivability and the ability to keep going and continue to provide the critical mission services that you need when the grid isn't there, right? Resiliency is a challenge to reliability more than a complement to it. It's a new way of thinking about it. It's not another way to describe reliability. It's something fundamentally different, I think. And so with that, I wanted to introduce Kevin Cushman, the CEO of Blue Pillar. And Blue Pillar is one of the, I think they're one of the most exciting companies around working in this space, and have really affected the way I think about the resiliency value proposition. So with that, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this today. I did have a real quick, since we were on a little bit of a Jim Rogers anecdotal session earlier, and I don't know if Jim's still here. About 15 years ago, I was working for Jim at Synergy in Cincinnati, working in the M&A group, and we at that point had started to see technology companies rolling into the utility asking for help. Can you adopt our technology? Could you test us? Could you pilot us? And at that point, we were asked and tasked to review some of these folks and take a look at technologies, both from an engineering but also from a business model perspective. And it was at that point we kind of came to Jim and said, why don't we take a more formalized approach to this? Look at technology through a different prism in terms of its disruptive capacity for the utility standard business model. And at first it wasn't super well received, I wouldn't say, not by Jim necessarily, but by the core folks whose capital had to be allocated to their own specific business units. And after a while thinking about it, Jim recognized that this was something that a company of that size at that point, this was before the Duke merger, needed to pay attention to. And I think that theme has rolled through what Duke and others have spent time doing lately in terms of looking at new technologies and trying to find ways to infuse them into their business units. So as a 29-year-old in 1999, he said, great, you're disposable, you go do that, and find ways to put money to work in that regard. And what we've seen the utilities do, I think, has almost come full circle in that regard. So when Jim talks about what Duke's doing on microgrids and specific pilots and so forth in North Carolina, what we're seeing there is a continued evaluation process, a testing process. But what we haven't seen, and I'll touch on this in terms of resiliency, is how utilities are adopting disruptive business models and looking at those business models over the course of their next 20, 30, 40 years, how they're actually going to displace revenue. How will they displace margin and earnings, and why not specifically allocate portions of their balance sheet to those assets currently and grow along with the opportunity. So out of that background, I'll introduce myself as the CEO of Blue Pillar. Blue Pillar is a software business located in Indianapolis. We primarily work with critical power customers, commercial industrial customers, healthcare customers, universities, manufacturers, and military, really to secure and network their distributed energy assets. So in this case, I'm not as much of a policy guy as I am an applications guy and a vendor to customers who ultimately are struggling with the variability in power quality, the opportunities to participate in the energy markets, and the struggle for resiliency based on things such as Superstorm Sandy. I'll start with a little bit of an anecdote as to how we interact with customers and what we're seeing from a resiliency front. We have a customer that we're working with most recently, Bellevue Hospital in Manhattan. As you well know, Bellevue sits right along the East River and a next-door neighbor to New York University's Langone Medical Center, which was the poster child for Superstorm Sandy impact on critical facilities. Bellevue estimates they had 40 million gallons of water in their basement at the time Sandy hit. What that meant was their infrastructure was poorly set up to respond to that, not because they didn't have the correct amount of generation capacity, but because the generators were on the roof and the switch gear and fuel system pumps were in the basement. So think about that. The result of that was probably the most manual approach to resiliency the country's seen in the last 30 years, which is firefighters filling buckets of diesel and running up steps to the generators on the roof in order to keep certain generators running for certain parts of the buildings. We're talking about a building system that's been in operation for almost 300 years. So we were introduced to that opportunity as they were taking a physical infrastructure rebuild approach to certain parts of their infrastructure, but also looking for systems and technologies that could effectively and efficiently normalize resiliency operations across their entire footprint. So what we've done is come in and said, things you're not going to rebuild, let's pull those forward with technology. Let's allow data transfer, dispatchability, and interoperability to occur with the new gear and the old gear. And what we're seeing is a graduation of thought processes to why build what you can optimize, why overlay with new metal we can actually pull together in a networking format. So part of the conversation I hope we have on the panel coming up today is determining what the ROI for resiliency is. If you approach someone like Bellevue or NYU or somebody recovering from a massive natural disaster, that's less of a concern. But if you're making pitches or proposals to folks who are looking to invest in resilient systems, how do you present the return on investing in a system that may only be called on once every 10 or 20 years? How do you actually create an ongoing value stream that pulls in the assets that you want to cover? So I'd like to cover off on that, if we could, Bill, later on in the conversation. And I look forward to being the application tech guy to balance out the policy discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. That was great. Just to emphasize, I think that the traditional resiliency investment, efficiency is not one of the criteria you consider. Nobody cares about efficiency. When you really are looking at resiliency, that's not a question typically that people ask. That is why it's so important for policy to play a role in making the right decisions about how we invest in resiliency. And I think that the AGA and Rick Murphy's work on combined heat and power's role in resiliency is really an example of just that kind of work we need to really understand how the right resiliency investments can be promoted. So with that, I'd like to introduce Rick Murphy from the American Gas Association. Oops, sorry.
Thank you, Bill. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be back in Boston, my hometown. Rick Murphy, as Bill mentioned, Managing Director for Sustainable Growth at the American Gas Association in Washington, D.C. And as I say, it's great to be back here, reacquainting with a lot of old friends. American Gas Association, for those who aren't real familiar, is the industry association that represents the local distribution companies of the gas industry. So our members are about 200 investor-owned utilities, the companies that take the natural gas from the interstate pipelines and deliver it across their pipeline systems to the end users. So although we're at that sector of the industry, everything that happens upstream of the distribution in this sector of the industry certainly impacts the value proposition for the product and for the customers that we serve on a day in and day out basis. I'm going to be able to share with you a number of slides, and the previous panel is tough to follow because they did a great job at a high level really addressing some of the critical issues that are out there. And I'm going to try to be complementary to what they've shared, and avoid being a little bit in the way of redundancy. So, I'm going to bring a little bit of a different perspective to this panel because I'm actually going to talk about resiliency from the standpoint of DG and CHP as identified as a potential solution to improve the resiliency and the reliability of the energy system. Isn't it critical that we ensure that the primary fuel source that's driving those DG and CHP applications, have the fundamental characteristics that customers and you all in this room can depend upon long term. The future outlook for natural gas is the brightest it's ever been for the 30-plus years I've been in the industry. We are poised as natural gas industry to be the foundation fuel for this country for years to come. You may have heard the saying, natural gas is a bridge fuel, and that has been the historical perspective. But we are not the bridge fuel, we are the foundation fuel, and I'm going to help to provide some of the information and the facts behind why that is the case. So my presentation will cover a broad range of areas, from the production end of the business, what's happening on a supply resource base, what's happening on the interstate pipeline, what's happening on the distribution sector, but also what's happening on the end use part of the industry. The positive outlook for natural gas is shared by policymakers across this country, including our president. President Obama, in the last year or so, has pronounced natural gas very well within his speeches. Most recently, his State of the Union address really accentuated the role of natural gas. This slide provides just a couple of the quotes from his recent speeches. And he also talks about natural gas and natural gas solutions, and has specifically talked about combined heat and power as a solution that can deliver benefits to this country to address energy costs, emissions from energy production, as well as improving the competitiveness of our manufacturing base. You may have all seen this announcement back in August of last year. President Obama issued an executive order which challenged the country to increase the deployment of CHP by approximately 50% over the existing capacity today, and recognized that if we are able to accomplish that, this country would invest $40 to $80 billion in new capital investments in plants and facilities, save American manufacturers approximately $10 billion each year in energy costs, save approximately 1% of the entire energy that's used in this country, and reduce emissions by the equivalent of taking 25 million cars off the road. So not only is our policymakers talking about the role of natural gas, but the role of natural gas applications, including combined heat and power. At the core of the positive outlook for natural gas is the dramatic change in our resource base. Jim Rogers mentioned this earlier, that it was through the incredible productive combination of two American-made technologies, hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, that have enabled us to access these shale gas plays that have historically been viewed to be out of reach. But now we're able to not only reach them, but produce this gas at a very affordable price. Despite the hyperbole that you may hear about shale gas production, it is very well supported across the country and through key policymakers. Our new Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz, has been a strong proponent of shale gas production and the future of that. You may have seen slides like this or a map like this, but this shows where the shale plays exist across the United States. And the really important point, particularly for this audience, is the location of where these shale gas plays are versus where we've traditionally gotten our gas in the past. Historically, we're dependent upon gas from Texas, Louisiana, and in the southwestern part of the country. Now we have significant resources in the northeast, in the Marcellus Shale, and having these resources in proximity to where the large population and demand sectors are is absolutely critical as we move forward as a foundation fuel. According to the Energy Information Administration and the Potential Gas Committee, the U.S. has an estimated future supply at today's current demand levels to last over 100 years. And in this particular slide, you can see that the actual resource base has grown by about 100% over the resource base just a few years ago. primarily driven by shale gas. The area on that bar chart on the far right with the red lines going through that represents the resources attributable to shale. Shale is at the shale resources are at the same level that our total resource base was just in 2004. Some of the people who are closest to this work actually think these estimates are well below what the opportunities exist. So the ability to efficiently tap into this resource base has resulted in significant changes in the production end of the natural gas sector. This slide shows what the production levels have been since the emergence of shale gas. You can see during the period of approximately 2007 to 2010, on average, we were producing about 53 BCF a day. Just over the last couple of years, we are now up in the range of 65 BCF per day. So it has triggered a significant amount of production in the production sector of the industry. Advances in production and the ability to extract this at affordable prices has also had a dramatic change on the actual commodity price of natural gas. You can see on the line graph showing for 2011 and 2012 versus a 5-year price range from 2006 to 2007. The price is well below where the ranges have been during that period of time, and a much narrow band of price fluctuations within that band. And as importantly, as you look going forward, if this is sustainable, if you look at the 2013 price levels over what has happened over the last 2 years with the emergence of shale, it has stayed within that same range, which is indicative of our ability to maintain this level of production as well as this level of price for well into the future. There's also significant potential for utilizing natural gas more effectively in homes and buildings. And quite honestly, when you look at that price range that I shared in the previous graphs and look at our ability to sustain those price levels going forward, we are in a much different environment today than we've ever been in the natural gas industry. We've gone from being in a supply-constrained environment to a demand-constrained environment. So what we need to do is ensure that we have the opportunities to utilize this resource base in homes and buildings with new and innovative approaches for utilizing the product. This provides proof that even with aggressive demand scenarios going forward, our supply base can effectively meet any future demand growth in the natural gas sector, including LNG exports. For those who believe that is going to actually take hold, the work that we've done at AGA has fully supports that our supply base, and in particularly shale, can help us maintain any kind of demand resources going forward. I had mentioned that AGA had done some work in looking at this, and we worked with Wood Mackenzie to look at various plausible demand scenarios for the next 10 years and how the price of natural gas could fluctuate during that period of time. So even in the most aggressive demand scenarios, we saw natural gas being able to be delivered to market over the next 10 years at a price of around $4 to $6 per MMBTU. I had mentioned about the need to have demand growth opportunities and the tremendous opportunities that exist out there, and particularly in this region of the country, to utilize natural gas more effectively in homes and buildings. Oil still has a sizable market share within this market. We have the ability to convert oil customers and provide those customers with lower operating costs, as well as helping to improve the environment. However, CHP represents one of those key demand drivers. And in my role at AGA, part of my responsibilities is to ensure that the value proposition of our company's distribution systems remain relevant and can be enhanced long term. So we're looking at where those demand opportunities represent, and our members believe CHP does represent an opportunity for our industry. Earlier this year, we contracted with ICF International to do a market assessment of combined heat and power opportunities across the country. ICF is very well regarded, have very robust databases around what exists in the marketplace across the country for facilities that could be conducive for using combined heat and power. And so we engaged them to really look at what the opportunities are for CHP, but more importantly, what those opportunities really mean to the natural gas industry, and more specifically what they mean to the natural gas utility distribution companies, because a lot of the existing capacity for CHP is not fed off of the distribution system. So this chart here really gives a high-level overview as to what that potential is. So the technical potential for remaining CHP is in the vicinity of approximately 123 gigawatts. This slide provides the sectors where the existing potential or the existing capacity is and where the future potential is. A key takeaway from this slide is the potential exists in sectors that are not where the existing capacity exists today. And these sectors aren't familiar with CHP, as all of you well know. We then peeled back the onion with ICF to say, all right, this is the technical potential, but once you start looking at the economic drivers that impact whether a customer moves forward with a CHP application or not, how does that start to reduce that potential? So in this particular slide, looking across every single state and doing a high-level economic analysis, we determined that there was approximately 41.6 gigawatts at facilities that could achieve paybacks of approximately 10 years or less. So it's still a significant size. And we also looked at paybacks below 5 years, and that opportunity is about 6 gigawatts of potential. I won't go into the details of these slides, but then we looked at some various scenarios as to what if the cost of CHP systems were to decrease by a certain percent. What would happen if the price of electricity were to go up? And what would be the corresponding impact on the ability to improve those economics? And then we converted those scenarios into what it really means to the natural gas industry. So in summary, what it does represent is there's sizable opportunities for the natural gas industry through CHP to grow their throughput, grow their demand in the range of 2 to 4 TCF per year. That represents about 12 to 18% of the existing demand today. I'm not going to get into this because Bill actually addressed this earlier today, but in order to deliver this value to the end-use customers, we need to make sure that we can actually get the gas to market. I forget which one of the panelists previously indicated that our distribution system, our pipeline infrastructure in this country is the envy of the world. We have over 2.4 million miles of pipeline in the ground today that can bring natural gas to market, unlike any other country in the world. However, there are issues that we need to address. There are challenges, and Bill touched upon this in the Northeast, is how do we ensure that this demand for natural gas in the Northeast can be satisfied with the expansion of pipelines. Northeast states have aggressively looked at how do we expand natural gas infrastructure, how do we get natural gas to more homes and businesses. A key component of that will be our ability to get pipelines. This is a slide that provides some of the work that's being done in this space today. These projects went online this year. In the Northeast, primarily in the Mid-Atlantic region. It has significantly improved not only the capacity within those markets, but be able to get affordable shale gas to the markets and drive down those costs. Moving further north in the Northeast, we have about 5 pipelines that serve the Northeast, as you may all well know, and there are real challenges in the Northeast that Bill alluded to. The fact of the matter is, customers who are served by the local distribution companies do not have a capacity issue. because local distribution companies commit and contract for firm capacity on the interstate pipelines. The challenges are when the increased demand from power generation for natural gas, and there aren't incentives in place for power generators to contract for firm commitments. That is one of the primary factors that is driving this issue when there are coincidental peaks between the gas utilities and power generators that are driving some of these capacity issues. The pipeline development process is pretty basic. Before pipe can be put in the ground, there has to be commitment from end users, LDCs, power generators, off an interstate pipeline. Until they are able to do that, they can't put a shovel in the ground. LDCs are typically the ones that commit to those firm commitments. Some of the projects in New England that are being proposed right now to address some of the capacity issues and in turn bring affordable supply to New England are listed here. Again, these projects are contingent upon our ability to get commitments from LDCs and power generators. So, in summary, the key themes are shale gas abundance is real. The technology, the resource base is real. It has impacted production and price positively. The technology from the wellhead to the burner tip will continue to advance with greater production and utilization of the product. We do anticipate relative market stability over plausible demand scenarios. Demand growth is needed to send the right signals to the production sector to actually continue to extract this product from the ground. And securing pipeline capacity is critical, particularly for this region. There are opportunities to expand natural gas in this region. Pipelines are going to be critical. So with that, I'll turn it over to the rest of our panelists.
Just go down. Hold on. A second here. Look. Yeah, apologies for 1 second while we get this sorted out. We're your local utility today. Yeah. So, a quick note. I think some of the interesting history here on resiliency is that the ROI issue is really the critical issue. If people pay more for resiliency, they expect more from what they're paying, right? And I think NYSERDA and the others have learned that the added costs of being resilient are significant and often create a lot of problems in selling the systems. So you need to know and be able to communicate what your ROI is. And a big part of that is how you contract and how you capture the value. So when you invest in CHP, for instance, you are creating resiliency value, and you're often not capturing them. Those values, you've got to capture them, or the project, the economics won't pencil. So one of the key aspects of doing that is, in addition to what Kevin does, but is also how you set up the system contractually. So with that, I'd like to introduce Phyllis Kessler from Duane Morris.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for inviting me here, Bill. I am of counsel at Duane Morris, and for those of you who don't know, we are both a national and an international law firm. I practice in the energy area. And Duane Morris itself is in most of the major cities in the U.S., so we're in many major markets. And while I am actually located myself in the New York office, and I do a lot of work in New York and New Jersey, and I'm a Jersey girl, but I have worked on projects all over the country. Now, I actually, because I am living in New Jersey, lived through Superstorm Sandy. I am very familiar with PSE&G. It was very good to see Ralph LaRosa this morning. Part of what I've done post Superstorm Sandy, both in the firm and in my client work, has been to think a lot about the reliability issues post-Sandy. I'm working currently on a PSE&G case that involves the impact on the utility. It's called Energy Strong, looking at the post-reliability. But what Bill asked me to talk about today was contractual issues that can be addressed in order to make systems more reliable. So let's say a superstorm hits your area. What kinds of things are we going to look at? In my view, the two things that you need to look at are how you can prepare for creating reliability and resiliency from a contractual point of view in advance, and then and how are you also contracting for resiliency? In other words, how do you make sure that once the storm is hit, your system is going to be resilient? So now, these things are pretty obvious that one of the things that most people have been talking about and actually that was just spoken about is how distributed generation can help support reliability. But I want to move on to the contractual issues and the I'm going to continue to speak, whether the slides are working or not. So the three areas actually that that Bill had asked me to speak about are PPAs, gas contracts, and insurance. And just to say, since I was asked to speak about three areas, what I'm going to do is talk about really just some high-level issues, and in particular, because the time is short, I can only touch on certain issues. Although there are a lot of issues that I deal with in the various types of contracts, what I'm going to focus on here is just to give you some examples of particular types of contractual provisions that you can think about and negotiate to address reliability issues. So first of all, your power purchase agreement. If you're a developer, somebody who's supplying electricity, usually to an end user, or alternatively, if you're an end user, and I've represented both sides, you frequently are going to provide your supply through a power purchase agreement. And just to say also that I tend to be in power purchase agreements, it's technology agnostic. I mean, you're going to end up that's okay. Yeah, what you're going to do is modify your power purchase agreement depending on the technology, but I have dealt with CHP, solar, wind technology, biofuel. You can do battery, microgrid. All of those different types of technologies can be covered. So do we want to try to put the slides up again?
Yeah. I apologize. We'll make sure to send everyone a copy of the presentation as well.
But basically, in your PPA, if we're talking about reliability issues, you got to have a reliable machine. And what are the provisions, top provisions that protect reliability? One of them is going to be what are your specifications? A very important issue if you're dealing with reliability is going to be how much wind, how much rain, how much flooding can the facility and the particular machine withstand? And bear with me one second. No. Okay. Next issue. If you have damage in your facility, contractually you want to provide for who's going to pay for that damage. Is it going to be the developer? Is there going to be a sharing? How long do you have to actually make those improvements? If the improvements aren't made within a given period of time, can the contract be discontinued? How do you deal with it? I mean, there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of problems. If you're the developer, you don't want to terminate the contract and be left with the machine because what do you do with it? So all of these things are things that you want to address in your contract. Then do you have a force majeure? And do most people in the room know what a force majeure is? Show of hands. Okay, great. Okay, so I don't have to explain that. But an important thing in your contract is being very specific to define what is your force majeure. In certain locations, you might not have a hurricane be considered to be the type of force majeure that we would consider it in the Northeast. You know, in the Caribbean, hurricanes are a normal event. That's not to say that it's not going to be a big issue, but in the Northeast, you're going to have a lot more concern if your hurricane takes your machine out, I believe, if you're not properly prepared for it. So you're going to want to do that definition. Siting. Where are you siting your machine? And we just heard about Bellevue with the machine on the roof and the controls in the basement. You need to think about those types of things in your contracting, particularly if you're the end user. You want to make sure that you're going to have a reliable equipment. So what's the location in the building, what's the elevation, et cetera. What happens if your machine goes down? Are you providing in your contract for some type of standby service? If not standby service, can you go back to utility service? What if your utility is down? And you may or may not want to provide for that, but that's an issue that needs to be considered. Then a big issue right now, particularly because I've been involved in a number of proceedings in New York and New Jersey, is interconnection. And can you actually separate yourself and isolate from the power grid? And this has been a big issue in particular with solar, but it's been an issue also with CHP plants. One of the reasons why NYU was able to run as effectively as it could during Superstorm Sandy was because it was isolated from the grid. Now, the second topic that I was asked to talk about was gas contracting, and gas contracting being the steady stream of fuel for your machine if you are a CHP or other type of gas-generated machine. So what are the key provisions? You have to have deliverability. And in gas contracting, basically what you're contracting for is both your end-use commodity and your pipeline deliverability. It's a deliverability through the interstate pipeline, and then ultimately the gas comes to you usually through your gas utility for the distribution piece. But when you're contracting for commodity and what they call basis, and your pipeline capacity can be firm, although in my experience, most CHP plants do not buy firm capacity. They'll either buy secondary firm or they'll buy interruptible. And secondary firm means that if there's a need for a higher use, let's say, by a utility, because usually what you're doing is buying off of a contract where the utility has the primary contract and they sell off a portion of the interstate pipeline capacity, they can pull the gas back and you won't be able to get your gas in your machine. So how do you deal with that? And how do you deal with it if you have an interruptible supply? I mean, there's a couple of different ways that you can deal with this. And one is to have dual fuel capacity. But since oil tends to be relatively expensive these days compared to natural gas, that may be much too much of a high-cost solution. You need additional equipment for your plant. You need space for fuel storage, et cetera. So one solution that I've been hearing about and that is important in the contracting currently is you could, for example, not contract for firm gas supply, but then have either a separate contract or as part of your gas contracting a piece that would allow you in an emergency situation to buy firm gas. It would be at a higher cost than your other cost of gas, but you could contract for that, and that would be a solution to make sure that you have greater reliability on your gas supply. Another issue is, how long is your gas contract going to be for? Right now, we're looking at low-cost gas. Do you want to lock in for 5 years? Do you want to lock in for 10 years? That's an awfully long gas contract, but and very often parties who are contracting for gas don't want to be wrong, so therefore what they do is they contract on a short-term basis, 2 years, maybe 3 years, but that's a consideration. How long do you want to enter into your contract? The pricing I talked about, commodity and basis. There's also an issue in your gas contracting. What happens if you use more gas? How is that going to be priced? That's something you need to address. What if you don't take all of the gas that you've contracted for? What price do you sell it back for? You may not get a specific price, but at least you want to have in your contract a formula that will provide a guide for how you end up paying for additional gas that you need or selling back gas that you don't need. Again, in gas contracting, we have force majeure provisions. One of the provisions that was a big concern for me in the past in doing gas contracting, very often your force majeure clause, if you're the gas company, you may say, well, if we have freezing of wells, we don't have to provide gas to you. So if you're buying the gas, you've got to look at freezing of wells, how widely. You want to make sure that that's narrow and only in the area that your gas is coming from. The other thing is you want to make sure that with a force majeure, it's not a price majeure. In other words, if the price bumps up to a certain level, can they take the gas back from me? No. If you're doing it for reliability, you have to make sure that that's not going to happen, because inevitably in an emergency, gas is going to get tight and the price is going to jump. Now, the third area that Bill asked me to speak about is insurance. And question is, how does insurance relate to reliability and having distributed generation? How can that help you with your insurance? So basically, if you have proper insurance, that's going to help you get money to pay for any damage that might happen in the event of a superstorm. So you want to make sure that you have proper both property insurance and what's called business interruption insurance, and that can compensate for losses. But you have to make sure that you have the right insurance coverage, and not only business interruption, which can cover losses of net profit, property damages, or other continuing expenses. But you might have an issue where, let's say the storm creates major damage to a pipeline and you can't get gas to your plant, you can't run your plant. Your business interruption insurance is very often not going to cover that situation. So you need to have what usually is going to be a rider to your insurance policy, which will provide for contingent business interruption in the event that the service disruption isn't your service disruption, but service disruption of a third party. Because if you're not having actual damage to your facility, but it's the third party that's had the damage, you're not going to get paid directly for your business interruption insurance. Another way to motivate for the insurance industry to motivate the development of DG is for the insurance industry to provide incentives to motivate resiliency. And this can be done, I believe, from the industry's point of view, is to actually try to start to work with the insurance industry to help them consider either requiring emergency generation in buildings, to look at providing more resiliency through DG, to adopt the best technologies that are available, and that can include PV, solar batteries, DG, et cetera, portable generation. But I think the other thing that's probably not being considered as much, where the insurance industry can have a really big impact, actually is also that the insurance company invests a lot in real estate. And to start to move the insurance industry towards protecting their real estate with distributed generation, I think, is another place that DG can impact the insurance industry and vice versa. So in conclusion, the storm protection has become important because as the climate's changing and the world is changing, we need to think through the assets that need to be protected and then to negotiate contracts accordingly. So I want to thank you and look forward to hearing the next panelist speak.
Thank you, Phyllis. And again, I apologize for the technical difficulties. Quickly, I remember emailing Dana, who was our next speaker, and the night Irene was coming in to New York City, and we all thought it was going to be the end of the world. I emailed Dana and said, we got to watch what CHP does, right? And Irene didn't come that year, but it did the Superstorm Sandy came the following year, and we all knew what was going to happen. We all knew that CHP was going to stay up. The story behind that is really testimony to NYSERDA's program. So I'm going to let Dana talk, and then we'll do a Q&A with the speakers. Get your presentation here, Dana. Here we go.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks to Wade and NECHP, Bill, Steve, and David for inviting me to speak. I'm going to focus my comments on resiliency, the topic of this panel, and the short message I have is that the $100 million budget that NYSERDA has for CHP incentives, this pool of money, $100 million, is going to build CHP systems that each and every one of them can run during a grid outage. So that is a significant component of the resiliency activity that we are seeking to achieve. I also want to highlight that of this $100 million, more than half of that we intend to spend on projects that will be built in New York City within the next 2 years. Not just contracts awarded, but projects actually built and operational in New York City within the next 2 years. And part of that challenge is getting to yes. Getting the customer to say, yes, I want CHP, getting the customer to say yes quickly, and then getting the systems built quickly. By compressing both parts of that timeline, getting to yes quickly, and then getting the system built quickly, we think we can actually get that magnitude of CHP built that quickly in New York City. In order to get to yes quickly, the format of our program was crafted in a way that we think we can accelerate the uptake of CHP. And I want to highlight this just real quickly to explain the format of the program and why that contributes to this resiliency aspect. For program administrators, state administrators that run energy efficiency programs, there's really two main styles for these programs. There are competitions. Periodically, you announce a call for proposals. You get those proposals. You get a group of judges. You strategically select those projects that are going to advance the mission you're trying to accomplish. For a decade, we ran a CHP program. We called it the CHP demonstration program as a competition. We were looking for a broad portfolio of projects that was going to create a vast suite of examples that customers could learn from. And after about 5 or 6 years of running this competition and building this portfolio, we started to see that certain projects really made sense. They were really, the killer apps. But we didn't want to repeat that project because it didn't further expand our portfolio. So NYSERDA created a second program, our CHP performance program, which really was intended to take these proven solutions and replicate them as best as possible. So for the last 5 or so years, we've had these two programs, the CHP demonstration program and the CHP performance program. The CHP performance program is run as a standard offer, and it's really this third style of the standard offer, performance-based payments. Essentially, that program puts all the risk on the developer. Your project doesn't work, you don't get paid. You don't show up for work, you don't get paid. That protects the ratepayer money, that protects the public money. NYSERDA, we came up with a crazy hypothesis. What if we could run a CHP program using the simplified standard offer program, this first of the 3 standard offers, a list of pre-qualified, essentially a menu, a catalog of pre-approved equipment with an assigned rebate? Can we do that in a way that also protects the public funds and ensures that we're going to get good quality projects that are going to run? And that is a program that we have just recently launched. We call it the CHP Acceleration Program or the CHP Catalog Program. And the mechanism is that we have invited equipment vendors that have pre-engineered modular CHP systems to give us catalog cuts that show the quality of their equipment. We've gone through a very rigorous review to determine which systems we have confidence in. And we've admitted those particular systems to the catalog. Each system within the catalog has been assigned a dedicated rebate, and you can see the decreasing per unit incentive, the rate in dollars per kW, as the systems get larger. We expect some sort of economy of scale. But I just want to highlight, for example, a 300 kW system would receive a $510,000 rebate when it's installed and becomes operational in New York State. There's also a bonus payment if that system is installed at a mission-critical facility, and that could be an evacuation shelter, it could be a hospital, it could be a supermarket, it could be a telecommunications. We've got a vast list of what we consider to be mission-critical facilities. But that 300 kW system would get an additional 10% bonus, an additional $51,000 additional bonus, so that would be a $561,000 incentive for that particular system. We also give credit to systems that have an absorption chiller based on the displaced electricity. So if it was, say, a 280 kW prime mover, and it was matched up with an absorption chiller that represented 20 kW of displaced electricity, we would call that a 300 kW system, and that would get the $510,000 incentive. The catalog of systems that we have, there's 10 vendors with 64 different modules that we have available, and this consists of engines and microturbine-based systems. This particular catalog does not include fuel cells. We have a separate catalog for fuel cells, and in fact, a 300 kW fuel cell through the fuel cell catalog can qualify for $1 million. So we have these pair of catalog programs that support engines, microturbines, and fuel cells as well. We've also taken an approach to try to help streamline the sizing of the system. We've got these rules of thumb that help a customer feel confident that they're getting a properly sized system. But we realize that there may be situations where there could be a unique situation at a building that a larger system might actually be appropriate for them. For example, two seemingly similar hotels, and we can see that the rule of thumb would suggest that a 60 kW system would be appropriate, but if the hotel has all of these additional thermal loads, we would invite them to explain to NYSERDA their additional loads, and we would then help reach a decision of a larger system being appropriate for them. All of the items in the catalog can run during a grid outage. If you are a vendor of CHP and you're not in the catalog, this is the mechanism here, our request for information, how to present your catalog cut sheets to NYSERDA so we can add you to the catalog. As I said, the catalog now has 10 different vendors and 64 different modules in it. When it was first launched, we had 8 vendors and 36 modules. We've got a few more vendors, some additional modules that are in review right now. This catalog will continue to expand. When we launched it, we had $20 million of available funds. We've gotten an infusion of additional funds, so this catalog program now has a $60 million pool of funds available for support of projects. I need to update the slide. This has the 8 original vendors with the 36 different systems. I've got to figure out a way to squeeze 10 vendors and 64 systems onto the page and have it still be somewhat legible. But the image I'm trying to convey here is that we have a catalog that covers the whole gamut of size ranges that we're trying to promote through this approach. This is a particular item that also enhances resiliency, and I want to try to quickly explain this. This is a new feature for us as part of this catalog approach. We have what we call N plus 1, or N times 2 type systems. So, for example, if a building is appropriately sized for a 600 kW system and they want an N package, they can get either a single 600 kW generator or a pair of 300 kW generators in that package, and that would be 600 kW nameplate rating of the system, and it would qualify for the incentive as shown. However, if for additional resiliency and redundancy, they want to have a spare generator that they would rotate through. And so now, instead of requiring a major overhaul of the equipment at a certain interval of time, by having an N plus 1 module that they can rotate through, that extends the interval of time for that major overhaul. So they could either have a pair of 600 kW generators, and they'd run one generator this week, and the other one would be idle, and then they'd run the other generator the next week, and the first one would be idle, and they'd alternate back and forth. And you can see the incentive that would get. Or they could have 3 300 kW generators, and they'd run 2 of them. They'd run 600 kW at any given time, and the third one would be the rotating one that would be sitting idle. Or an N times 2 situation, and we may see some data centers that want completely redundant systems. So they might have a full package with 600 kW and another full package with 600 kW. We would provide the the full incentive for the first one and 50% of the incentive for the second one. We're providing this mechanism so that building owners can decide what really makes sense for them. One additional feature for folks that go with the N+1 or the N×2 situation, they're going to have an installed generator that will be sitting idle most of the time, and that would be something we would encourage them to enroll into the demand response program. It truly is a system that can be dispatched above and beyond their baseline operating activities. If somebody puts in an N+1 package and they've got a pair of 600 kW generators and one of them is down for maintenance at the time that the grid outage occurs, they've got their other generator that can step in and carry the load. Our two programs, and I'm going to skip over the slide very quickly, but we've got something for everyone. What I like to say is if you're looking to install, say, a boiler, if you're putting in a small boiler that can fit through the doorway, you usually buy a prepackaged boiler. If you're putting in a large boiler that is so large it can't fit through the doorway, you have a field-erected boiler. And similarly, we look at CHP. If it's small enough to fit through the door, we want to try to support it through a simplified approach. If it is so large that it can't fit through the doorway, we want to support it through a customized approach. I mentioned the $100 million. We've got funds for systems ranging all the way through from the small end of the scale to the large end of the scale. We've got a very significant budget to support this. This is a testament to the leadership in New York State, my boss, my boss's boss, my boss's boss's boss, all the way up to our leadership from Governor Andrew Cuomo. We've got the resources in order to support CHP so robustly. On Friday of this week, we have a matchmaking event. The 10 vendors that are pre-approved in the catalog at the moment have all been given a booth to exhibit their offerings. We are inviting building owners, architects and consultants, engineers that might specify CHP systems to come meet the 10 vendors, look at their systems that they're offering, and hopefully strike a deal. I just want to share some sunshine to the 10 vendors. Really, they're the ones that are making this program work for us, and I know several of them are in the audience here. If you're one of the 10 vendors and you're present, please stand up and be recognized. I'd like to really show my appreciation to the folks that are went through the grueling experience of convincing us that their equipment is durable and reliable, and so I want to give you all a round of applause. This is a first for NYSERDA. We are now in a position to actually say NYSERDA endorses these 10 specific vendors and the 64 modules that they offer. And we hope that that's going to help get customers to feel comfortable and confident, get to yes very quickly, and then get these systems built. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dana. I think we're a little bit pressed for time, so we're going to skip the Q&A with one exception. I want to ask something for Kevin. And part of the advantage of having Kevin here is that one of the things we really want to come out of this conference is for people to actually meet and make connections and for real deals to happen and to expand the ecosystem of CHP and distributed generation in New England and the Northeast. And having Kevin from Blue Pillar here is a real opportunity to do that. I think that you have the vendors here. I've told them about you and your company. I don't know how you can work with them, but I think there are opportunities to augment the value proposition for both sides of that equation. And so what I'd ask you is, how can Blue Pillar or companies like Blue Pillar engage with supply-side distributed generation?
Well, thanks, and it's really enviable to be the last guy to speak before lunch, so I'll keep it quick. It's a great question, and I think it does come to the core of what resiliency at the edge in the customer side really looks like, and I think it revolves around being as agnostic as possible to the metal, the technology solution, delivering power, the prime movers on site, and not looking at microgrids or resiliency investments in power generation or behind-the-meter equipment as a greenfield opportunity. I think you have to start with securing the asset portfolio that's in place at the present time, recognizing what the resiliency gaps are with that current portfolio, and then trying to incrementally walk it forward. So obviously when you have a storm that hits a major critical facility like a hospital or a military base, something along those lines, you're going to spare no expense to get that back online. But in order to trigger this as being a broader movement, you have to start creating incremental ROIs for those upgrades, those incremental investments in resiliency. So what I'd say as a vendor to that space where we're encountering all types of equipment, we built our company specifically to be technology, gear, manufacturer agnostic, so that we're gluing together and arranging portfolios that allow for those assets to serve multiple purposes. So they're generating savings day in and day out, offering optimization and efficiency to the teams managing those systems, but ultimately can creep up that resiliency curve as they go along. So they'll be prepared over time, and it's not just throwing metal at a problem that may require a more incremental or surgical approach. So we think crossing those two curves is really where resiliency takes hold in a larger market sense. So I would say, anyway, think about resiliency investments or the vendors looking to deploy technology, instead of going through the traditional RFP or trickle-down decentralization program that we heard a little bit about earlier, look for opportunities where smaller surgical deployments of technology can create wins earlier on. You create the cultural buy-in that is so difficult to do in a lot of cases without some sort of regulatory or governmental fiat to deploy capital.
That's great. All right, so I think we have lunch in Salon 5, and then we're going to, it's over there, and we should have some awards and a speaker. So if everyone could reconvene in Salon 5. Thank you. Thank you again to all the panelists.